I don't normally stand up here wearing a hat, but I wanted to show this one off. It says read, think, vote. And we just got these in. So they're available for everybody to purchase up front and to wear and give to your friends, and hopefully it'll help galvanize people to register and get out and vote when the time comes. I'm Bradley Graham. I'm the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine. And on behalf of everybody here in P&P, welcome. Thank you very much for coming out. It's always a great pleasure to have E.J. Dionne here at Politics and Prose. He's been here a number of times over the years. He's a great friend of the store, and it's always enlightening to get his thoughts on the nation's political condition. But it's especially nice to have him here at the end of what has been a rather pivotal and no doubt for many in this room, a depressing week in American politics. Judging from the size of the crowd here, many of you clearly know that EJ is worth listening to. We've been reading his stuff, it seems like, for decades. It has been for decades. First when he reported for the New York Times at home and abroad from the mid-1970s to the late 1980s, and then when he switched to the Washington Post in 1990 and began composing his columns in 1993. A lot of us, too, I suspect, have tuned into EJ's frequent commentaries on NPR or MSNBC, or we've been informed by the dozen previous books that he's either written or co-edited. Additionally, EJ continues to be associated with 3 institutions devoted to learning. He's a senior fellow at Brookings, and he teaches at Georgetown and at Harvard universities. Over much of his long, accomplished career in journalism and book writing, EJ has remained, as a recent New York Times reviewer noted, a consistent voice looking for common ground among opposing groups and advocating a politics of consensus. His personal history contributes to this bridge-building tendency. EJ grew up as a conservative in a conservative family, believe it or not, before shifting many years ago toward the center-left. And his frequent appeals for understanding and common cause between Republicans and Democrats have been rooted in an abiding respect for the conservative tradition. But in recent years, as anyone who's followed EJ's thinking can attest, he's become increasingly critical of a radicalized and deformed Republican Party and American conservative movement. And in his new book, Code Red, conservatives don't factor much at all. The consensus effort that EJ now urges isn't between Republicans and Democrats, but among Democrats themselves. In pleading with moderates and progressives within the Democratic Party to come together, he points to the 2018 midterms, when a combined Democratic push succeeded in flipping more than 40 seats in the House of Representatives. And that, says EJ, should be a model for what must be done to build a solid majority and unseat Donald Trump in 2020. It's certainly a compelling argument, not only for the good of the Democratic Party, but more importantly, for the good of the country. Now, EJ will be in conversation here with Deborah Tannen, who's also a very familiar figure, I'm sure, to many of you here. She's a linguistics professor, also at Georgetown University, and an accomplished author herself of many books. I think about 25 books now she's either written or edited, including the now classic You Just Don't Understand, and most recently, You're the Only One I Can Tell. Now, EJ and Deborah will talk for a bit, then they'll take questions, and then we'll end just shortly before 8 o'clock, and we're going to provide, of course, a live viewing of tonight's Democratic presidential debate, and E.J. will stick around to offer some commentary. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming E.J. Dionne and Deborah Tannen.
Hi, everyone. I'm as excited as you are to hear what EJ has to say about all these goings on. It's been a long introduction, but I couldn't resist starting by reading you just the titles of EJ's books, because he is so good with words, and everybody here, I'm sure, is a word person. So I just want to read these titles. The last one was One Nation After Trump, A Guide for the Perplexed, The Disillusioned, The Desperate, and The Not Yet Deported. And that was co-authored with Norm Ornstein and Thomas Mann. Next one. I'm going, of course, in reverse chronological order of these books. Why the Right Went Wrong, Conservatism from Goldwater to the Tea Party and Beyond. Next one. Our Divided Political Heart, The Battle for the American Idea in an Age of Discontent. Next one, Sold Out, but that is S-O-U-L-E-D, Sold Out, Reclaiming Faith in Politics After the Religious Right. And of course, E.J., you've been a really, really inspiring voice about how religion and politics interact. Next one, Stand Up, Fight Back, Republican Toughs, Democratic Wimps, and the Politics of Revenge. That's not really inspiring, but...
It was a hard time when I wrote that.
Like it isn't now, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, we thought it was a hard time.
Yeah. Next one, United We Serve, National Service and the Future of Citizenship, with two co-authors. This one I really like. They Only Look Dead. Why Progressives Will Dominate the Next Political Era. So maybe we should start with that one. Because there you were saying, this was 1996, why progressives will dominate the next political era. And now you're saying why progressives and moderates have to work together. So maybe you can just start right there.
Sure. First, a couple of things. First, I want to thank, am I on here? Can you hear me? Yeah. I want to thank this great bookstore, which is a bookstore, a community organization, sometimes for for some of us, it's a multi-service center, I think. God bless you, Brad and Lissa, and everybody who works here. Second, I want to thank Deborah. It's very intimidating to be answering questions from Deborah Tannen, because Deborah could tell you, well, he may have said that, but what he's really thinking is this. And I mean, that'd be kind of fun, but I hope she doesn't do that tonight.
I might.
Thirdly, I want to thank all of you for coming, including some very old friends from many different parts of my life, actually. And I always tell our kids that there aren't very many advantages to getting old, but one of them is you have old friends. So thank you all so much for coming, and also new friends who have come out tonight. Alice, would you take a bow? One of my editors from, where are you, Alice? Are you back? Oh, there you are. It was a brilliant editor at St. Martin's Press, and I've had the blessing of doing back-to-back events where my editor, Tim, was last night. Alice is here. God bless you for coming. Thank you. And her mom. Welcome to her mom. And my wife, Mary, is here. And, she has to listen to me all the time. She doesn't always have to listen to me. She hears me all the time, and it's really sweet of her to come out tonight. Thank you, Mayor. And my assistant, Amber Hurley, who is here, and Roma, my intern, are here somewhere. Amber is acknowledged in the book. She was essential to putting this book together. So you were asking about progressives. I always say, that book, They Only Look Dead. The day progressives have totally won is the day people stop laughing at that title of that book. In a sense, I was always describing, I think, a brand of progressivism that brought moderates and progressives together. That was written in 1996, after all, at the height of the Clinton era. Mary said that I never got adequate credit for that book because I was writing it right after Gingrich took over Congress, and I was arguing that this was not the future, and that turned out to be right in 1990. in 1996. But I wrote this book now out of a combination of alarm and hope. When you pick up the book, which I hope you will, and thank you, by the way, for the people who bought early without any proof of product. So it was nice of you to buy it early. The first sentence of the book is, "Will progressives and moderates feud while the country burns?" And I am very, very afraid, as I think a lot of people are, that people who broadly agree on so many things and clearly together have such fundamental disagreements with both Trumpism and a radicalized republicanism, that they will spend their time arguing as if the differences between them are larger than the differences between them and the political alternatives. And they really are not. In fact, they are, as I argue, they have much more in common than they want to acknowledge. What they have in common is an understanding that the country must move in a new direction. What they have in common arises from what I call, for fun, the politics of negative thinking. When you go back to Ronald Reagan, he built his movement out of negative thinking, which is to say he was anti-communist, anti-government, anti-tax. And out of that grew an affirmative conservative program, which many people in this room disagreed with, I disagreed with, but it had an awful lot of success. Indeed, some of the frustrations on the left side of politics now arise from a frustration that the Reagan consensus has dominated our politics for way too long, and we can talk about that. If I am worried about infighting and a realization that we are not going to recognize that in our opposition to the radical mistreatment of immigrants and refugees, in our opposition to the threats to democracy itself that Trumpism represents, in opposition to racism and sexism and discrimination against LGBTQ people, and in opposition to the rising inequality that we have suffered under as a country since at least 1980 and probably since 1973. If we can't pull together around those antis and then form an affirmative program in common, then we will be in a lot of trouble. And that's the hopeful part of the book. We will miss an enormous opportunity if we don't do that. The opportunity is very clear from the results of the 2018 election. Get your head around this number. In 2018, Democratic candidates for the House of Representatives got 25 million more votes than Democrats running for the House in 2014. That is an enormous shift in public opinion. They won that election because moderates and progressives, left and center left, found a way of working together. In the book, I traveled the country some during that campaign, and I write about, among other people, Ayanna Pressley and Abigail Spanberger. Ayanna Pressley won a Democratic primary, very progressive Democrat from Boston, African American, and Abigail Spanberger, a moderate former CIA agent who got elected from a Tea Party district in Virginia, near Richmond. I wrote at the time after the election that I want Abigail Spanberger and Ayanna Pressley to become best friends because they actually took a selfie together and after that came out. And I wrote that because each of them depends on the other. Each wing depends on the other. That Abigail Spanberger won in a moderate district in part because the energy that came from the progressive wing of the party. Ayanna Pressley's power in a Democratic Congress comes because moderates like Abigail Spanberger can prevail in districts like her. We have to learn to work together. And if you don't believe that, just watch President Trump's speeches yesterday. If that doesn't tell us, if that vindictiveness, and it's nothing short of that, if that way of talking about political opponents doesn't persuade you that we really have fewer differences with each other than we have with that kind of politics, I'll never persuade you. But I don't think I have to, I hope. And maybe you'll read the book if you still need persuasion. Sorry, that was a long answer, but you inspired me.
Anything you want to say, we want to hear it. You have a phrase that I really love. Maybe you could explain this, what you have in mind with this. Visionary gradualism.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's one of my favorite phrases in the book, and it's not mine. Any old Michael Harrington fans in the audience? Yeah, I loved Mike Harrington. For those of you who didn't know, he's the author of The Other America, the book that helped spark the anti-poverty program. John Kennedy read a review of the book, actually, by Dwight McDonald in the New Yorker, and it got him thinking about a war on poverty, which LBJ brought to fruition, which, by the way, has had more success than we want to know, but we could talk about that if we later on. But Mike Harrington was also a Democratic Socialist. A great story about Bill Buckley was on a panel with Harrington, and Harrington got introduced as America's leading Democratic Socialist. And those of you remember Bill Buckley, the conservative writer, was a very funny guy. And I think he had his pen and he said, America's leading socialist. That would be a bit like being the tallest building in Topeka. Bill Buckley would be surprised at how many Democratic Socialists there are in America today. But Mike Harrington coined the phrase visionary gradualism. And I love that phrase because to me it embodies what I am trying to argue about why progressives and moderates need to listen to what each side has to say. Progressives are absolutely right that we need visionary change, that we need fundamental change. There are things wrong with our country that we have to cure, things that helped elect Donald Trump, in fact, but also things that leave citizens at the bottom of the economy, citizens of color, in a situation that they shouldn't be in the United States of America that I think we all want to build. So programs should be visionary, but the gradualism part is what I think more moderate progressives, moderate center-left, are right about, which is in our history, we have often achieved fundamental change in steps. If you go to the history of Social Security, the original Social Security was not nearly as good as what it became. But if Franklin Roosevelt hadn't passed the original Social Security bill and accepted that he couldn't get quite everything he wanted, we wouldn't have the full system today, which really only came to fruition with a series of progressive amendments in the 1950s. There were two wholly inadequate civil rights bills that passed in the 1950s that helped pave the way for the great Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And Lord knows healthcare has taken us a long time. It took a long time between Medicare and Obamacare, but I really believe that the big step forward that we made in Obamacare is something we can build on. And so I think visionary gradualism is a combination of the goals we seek with the methods we may have to use to get there and to persuade our fellow citizens over time that they want to move forward. So I'm so grateful you asked about that phrase.
So maybe this is a good time to ask. I'll bet everybody in the room is absolutely convinced you're right that moderates and progressives have to work together, or the alternative is
living down the street.
Beyond scary to think about. So the big question is how that's going to happen. So thinking, for example, of visionary gradualism, which absolutely sounds right, but I think for many progressives, gradualism is a dirty word. Exactly what you're saying, that if we can't have Medicare for all, we don't want anything. So I guess my question is, we know why we need this. Can you tell us how it's going to happen?
That's a hard question.
Should I ask a different one?
I try to lay it out in the book. At the beginning of the book, I have a kind of mock argument, but it's a real argument that between a moderate and a progressive, and what would the progressive say and what would the moderate say back? And I had this fun experience, really, where a student was in my office and I had to finish a phone call, and the book had just come in. And so I just pointed to the book, and she started reading the book, waiting for me to finish with my phone call. And she said, you know, that debate you had between the moderate and the progressive, that sounded just like last night's Democratic debate I watched. I think there are a couple of things, a couple of paths here. Number one is the one I referred to before. As in 2018, I believe that the prospect of 4 more years of President Trump will concentrate a lot of minds. And I think we can comfort ourselves that primaries are difficult. I mean, you have a bunch of people running against each other, and each one thinks he or she is way better than that other person to become president of the United States. Otherwise, they wouldn't be running against each other.
I just want to interrupt to say a phrase that you have in the book that I absolutely love, that we all end up with these political superiority complexes.
Oh.
And I think
right.
each of the candidates has that, and many of us have it too.
Oh, thank you. I worry about moralism, which I think is different from morality. I worry about holier-than-thou-ness on the part of any of us, myself included, and progressives have it, but so do moderates, because moderates look at progressives and say, you impractical fools, you'll never get anything done, and the progressive looks at moderates and says, you sellout neoliberal who is going to give us up to big corporations, and if you start an argument like that, it's not going to be good where it ends up. But I think so I think Trump will concentrate our minds. And in the book, I lay out why each side might find some respect for each other. I'm very respectful. I try to be respectful to each side in this debate. For example, whether you are for Bernie Sanders or not, Bernie Sanders, I believe, did the country a huge service by changing the nature of our debate. That for a very long time after Reagan's victory in 1980, our political imaginations were really shrunk, and so was our conception of the political spectrum. It kind of ran from the right to somewhere around the center. I mean, think about this. They called Obamacare socialist. By putting single-payer health care on the table, Bernie Sanders reminded people, no, this might be socialism. Obamacare isn't socialism. Elizabeth Warren has talked about a wealth tax. I think it is time with concentrated wealth in the country to begin finding ways to tax it. After all, the wealth of almost everybody in this room and every middle-class person in the country is already taxed. You pay property taxes. That is a tax on the wealth that for most Americans is a very large share of their wealth. Now, whether we tax it the way she proposes or in other ways through higher capital gains taxes or reformed estate taxes, she has still broadened the conversation. So that is the respect, part of why I try very hard to say, for those who are moderate, there should be respect for that side. But I think for the progressive, there should be respect for the progress that people who were more on the center-left had made. And I have a chapter in the book on why I think it's a mistake for progressives to declare the Clinton and Obama administration's failures and to sort of spend your time bashing Clinton and Obama. Some of you may have seen an excerpt from the book in the Washington Post. My friend Ben Wattenberg, who is much more conservative than I am, once had a line where he said, liberals come before you and say, our programs have failed, let us continue. And I do say that the left has a reason for impatience with both presidents, that there were things that weren't done. They had to operate or chose to operate more than they might have had to within the old conservative consensus. Nonetheless, each solved the problems that were presented to them, and in certain ways, each tried to push against that consensus, but they didn't get all the way. And so to close, I would point out that FDR came out of the old progressive tradition, but he knew that old tradition of the 19-teens, the aughts and the teens of the last century didn't go far enough. So it is, I think, possible to respect the achievements of those who came before us on the broad progressive side of politics, but know that we can't stop there and there's work to do. And I think there is shared work that progressives and moderates can undertake together.
We can open it.
Oh, go ahead, yeah. Thank you.
We'll open it up to questions pretty soon. But in that spirit, what do you make of the results from Iowa, such as they are, and not talking about the chaos of Iowa, but to the extent that we have some sense of what the results were, that what apparently were the two front runners is one progressive, one moderate, and then third and fourth, one progressive, one moderate, which makes me wonder how much of it is about their views and how much is it about personality. And maybe that's a question about elections in general. The relative weight that ends up determining the election, the relative weight on the policies that people put forth, or simply personality and how people respond to their persona as it's perceived.
Well, I have an old friend I ran into in Ottumwa, Iowa, who's standing over there, who was campaigning. I went to a Buttigieg event, and there was this person from Bethesda I had known for a long time. And so I attribute Mayor Pete's showing entirely to Mike over there. But a mutual friend of ours said the other day that with Buttigieg, if you had kind of an old advertising campaign, it could be, all the moderation at half the age, and I use that not disrespectfully to Joe Biden, whom I do respect, but I think that Buttigieg managed to occupy a lot of the space that Joe Biden hoped to occupy. The Iowa caucuses were fought out on the issue Joe Biden wanted them fought out on. More than 60% of Iowa caucus goers told pollsters that they cared more about someone who could beat Trump than about a candidate's stand on the issues. That was the good news for Biden. The bad news for Biden, he only got about a quarter of those voters. Another quarter went to Mayor Pete, and then the rest were scattered among the other candidates. And so I think, number one, Iowa was a failure of Vice President Biden to persuade voters that indeed he was the guy who could beat Trump. Number two, I think Buttigieg on the center-left side ended up occupying the real ideological sweet spot in the state. If you look again at the entrance polls, the group that Buttigieg did best with were those who call themselves moderate liberals. Not very liberal, moderate liberals. He split the moderates with Biden, but he won this group very substantially. I think Amy Klobuchar was hurt because she couldn't be there. I think there was a real competition between Buttigieg and Klobuchar, and she was stuck in the impeachment hearing. And that also on the left side may have explained a little bit about Elizabeth Warren falling back. I mean, she had trouble because of the health care issue early on, which led to a decline in her support. What struck me about Bernie's vote is, A, it was strong, but B, it's not clear to me that Bernie has yet reached beyond his base of support. There was a lot of speculation that Bernie was going to run away with the thing, and he did win the popular vote. Let it be said, I respect the popular vote. I wish we used it in the presidential election. So that cannot be trivialized. But I think people might have, we're talking about a much bigger margin, and I think that what held it down some is the focus on who can beat Trump. And the Bernie people were making a real case for that. One of their bumper stickers said, Bernie beats Trump. But I think he still has a ways to go with a significant part of the party going forward. And now in New Hampshire, Buttigieg's victory seems to have identified him as the alternative to Bernie. And he seems to be coming up in the polls. And I think that we will see, if he wins there, I think that changes things substantially. I don't know if it's in the cards, but I am actually looking for something of a Warren comeback, even though I'm not sure I can see electorally how it's there, because she also occupies a kind of sweet spot in the party. Last point on Iowa. Bernie, if it were Bernie v. Biden, it would be generational warfare, just like some of us experienced in the late 60s and early 70s, because Biden is the overwhelming choice of the over 65s, and Bernie is the overwhelming choice of the under 30s. Both Pete and Elizabeth Warren, both Buttigieg and Warren, have fairly evenly distributed an age profile. Although, funnily enough, the 38-year-old leans a little older and the 70-year-old leans a little younger, which I suppose should make some of us older folks feel good.
I'll ask one more question and then we'll open it up. So if you have a question, you could start lining up at the microphone. There's only one tonight. Often there are two. There's one over here. And while people are making the way over there to this microphone here.
And there's no bias, because if you're a lefty, you can think of it as on the left side of the room. And if you're a conservative, you can look at it the other way and think it's on the right side of the room.
But I will ask one last quick question, again, from the book. You make an observation that the four very progressive new members of the House of Representatives called the Squad, there are four of them, but that what really has brought the majority, has put the Democrats in the majority, was a far larger number of moderate Democrats, including Spanberger, who you mentioned as one. And yet the Squad has gotten so much more attention, both from the press and certainly from the Republicans and from Trump, for reasons we know. So any comments about the relative attention that's been paid to those two groups, and any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think some of it is that AOC is simply a social media genius. And I think that that's the case in part because when she started out, social media was all she had. People didn't think she could win that race in Queens and the Bronx, and she had to find ways of reaching people. And she became a social media star, where I looked it up. I was teaching this some about this at Georgetown, and when we looked it up at the time, AOC, Speaker Pelosi, I'm making up these numbers. It was on this order. Speaker Pelosi had like 1 million followers. AOC at that time, it's way up. You can look it up on your phone. Already had 2.4 million followers than the Speaker of the House. So I certainly think that is part of it. And they also picked a few very high-profile fights. In a few cases, they said some very controversial, in some cases incendiary things. Less AOC than some of the others. And all of that gave them a lot of attention. None of these moderate members are media stars outside their own districts. There are a few who have come up. You've started seeing more of them on television. You're seeing a lot of Katie Porter, a former student actually of Elizabeth Warren. You're seeing her out there a lot, and she is very powerful. I think you're seeing Tom Malinowski, who's another of the newly electeds, is getting a lot of attention. Chrissy Houlihan, Mikey Sherrill in New Jersey. It's a very impressive group of people, by the way. And a lot of them are women. I mean, I think it's the largest new class of women in our history. And some of them don't want that kind of attention. Some of them want to do their jobs and reach their districts and get re-elected and are not looking for that kind of national attention. So I think that's some of it. And then, obviously, the Republican Party will take any controversial statement that anybody in the party makes, from any point of view in the party, but particularly on the left side of the party, and they'll blow it up and, if necessary, distort it to have a lot of attention. But I think some of it's just an inevitable product of the media world we live in. But I still attribute a lot of it to a genius AOC has for the new forms of media, and the fact that there is a very substantial progressive wing inside the Democratic Party. Sir?
So,
Well, yeah,
I love you carrying the book like
yes,
that. Thank you so much.
To reading it. I was just skimming through it just then. So I wanted to mention I canvassed for Spanberger many
great.
days in a row, even though my politics are much to the left of her, actually.
Hey, could I say how that's so important? That's exactly what I am trying to say, that one of the reasons these moderates prevailed is a lot of progressives like you were willing to say in a district like this woman is going to be the most progressive candidate we're going to elect. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious how you see, you defend the concept of progressive realism in terms of foreign policy in the book, and I'm wondering how you see the notion of the military budget and the need to cut it, which is something that Warren has espoused. Her cut would amount to, I think, about 11% cut, if I understand the math. That's, I imagine, politically risky in some ways. It did come up in one of the recent debates, but the question that she faces, the others do, is how do you pay for the things that she wants to pay for? From healthcare to other things, and she brings in a kind of a corporate welfare analysis into that proposal of hers as well. But I'm kind of how does progressive realism look at the military budget?
Let me just say, just very briefly, that chapter. I'd be very curious for those of you. The great thing about Politics and Prose is there's probably somebody who was once a deputy secretary of state sitting in your audience. So, but anyway, I'd love the people who are foreign policy mavens. I'd love you to take a look at that chapter, because in brief, what I argue is that in broad terms, I'm a liberal internationalist. I believe the United States should have an important role in the world. Because I worry about who would replace us if we withdrew. I don't really want a world dominated by China. I don't want a world dominated by Vladimir Putin. I'd like a world in which the United States plays a role in partnership with democratic allies and doesn't push them away, doesn't seem to preference dictators over long-standing democratic allies. On the other hand, I argue that liberal internationalism will fail unless it remembers Main Street and the shop floor and what's happening to people on the shop floor. And there I sort of take some words from Bernie and Warren and link them to words from Bernie and Buttigieg. And Bernie and Buttigieg are, broadly speaking, liberal internationalists, but Bernie and Elizabeth Warren are right to say that American foreign policy should be far more concerned with the economic interests of the average American than has been the case for some time. And the architects of the great liberal international order understood this. They were Harry Truman and Franklin Roosevelt. And they understood that part of their task was not only to keep the United States strong, but also to help create a world in which the working class and middle class was safe. That's the broad outline. Did I do justice to the chapter?
I think so.
I didn't want to rig what I said. On the military budget, I don't often quote Newt Gingrich in a positive way, but many, many years ago, Newt referred to himself as a cheap hawk. And back in those days, this was before he became speaker, I believe, Newt himself would talk about the need for restraint in the military budget, even though he was no dove. And he was looking, there were a lot of people in that period who were talking about military reform and saying we can't spend every dollar on every new weapon system that comes down the road. I am not a student of the military budget, so I don't want to go way over my skis on this. But the kind of buildup we've had over the last several years is so enormous. There's so much money in that budget that Trump can steal some of it for his wall. There's something, so I do think if a Democrat wins, or even if a Democrat doesn't, we need a debate about getting the military budget under some control. And so I'm glad you asked that question. Thank you. Sir.
Hi. It's good that you're here.
Oh, thank you. It's good that you're here.
Thank you. We try. I'm concerned about turnout and democratic mobilization. We had what looked to be an excellent turnout in 2018, considering the very low levels of participation in off-year elections. But this year, the Iowa caucus seems to show reduced turnout, or at least not elevated turnout. And my question really is, from your perspective, was it really reduced turnout? How do we build better turnout?
Thank you. I'm worried about those Iowa numbers too. I mean, they were not what people hoped for. And I don't have an answer yet. We'll see what happens next week in New Hampshire. I am curious what those numbers are like. I talked recently to somebody who's been very activist in various anti-Trump campaigns and Democratic campaigns, who says that he does not sense quite the same energy he sensed leading up to 2018. On the other hand, if you look not only at 2018, where there was enormous mobilization, but also at 2019, in unexpected places. If you look at what happened in the legislative, this is more expected, in the legislative races in Virginia, but also in the governor's races in Kentucky and Louisiana. Louisiana, for example, if you look between the first round and the runoff round, turnout was up more in Democratic areas than Republican areas. So I think the lesson of Iowa is if people are slagging off, they can't, and that there's more work that has to be done. But I am worried about this because, as I say at the beginning of the book, one of the things that gives me heart about the country is how much organization there was in the period immediately after Trump's election, not only in Democratic areas, but as the great scholar Theda Skocpol has found, traveling the country, a lot of new progressive movements and moderate movements in the heart of Republican country. And so I'm concerned, but I am heartened by what we've done up to now, and we got to figure out, is the Iowa turnout a glitch or a problem? Sir, my friend, how are you?
Yes, how are
Good
you,
to see
Jay?
you.
Always good to see you. Larry
Yeah,
Checker.
yeah.
I have a question for both of you, Deborah and yourself. How much of our politics is a war on words as much as it is a war on policy? For example, I mean, the health insurance reform versus health care reform. I think Obama would have had a much easier shot at getting it through, or an easier shot getting it through, if he called it a health insurance reform versus health care reform. But that's another. The word I'm really thinking about in this period is socialism and socialist. And what impact is that going to have if the Republicans can convince everybody that every Democrat that's ever walked the face of the earth is a socialist?
So I'm going to turn to the linguist to handle that question. I'll do it too, but I am actually really curious what you have to say.
Well,
about
absolutely, words matter, and many people have pointed out that the Republicans have been more successful at the war of words.
Yes,
Of
absolutely.
course, Frank Luntz was their maven, and it worked. And the other thing was that they stuck together. So when they decided that the inheritance tax would be called the death tax,
Exactly.
and people who had no inheritance didn't like the idea of death being taxed and jumped on the bandwagon. Then George Lakoff is a linguist who has tried to come up with ways that the Democrats could win the language war. And in fact, a number of years ago, I and George Lakoff and a few others of us were actually called in by the Democrats to help them come up with better words. And we did. And we had this meeting where we presented it to the Democratic senators, and they wandered in and out. And I don't think anybody was in the room more than 10 minutes, the same person, and nothing came of it. And many people at the time pointed out, you can't get Democrats to all mouth the same words as the Republicans seem to be able
They're
to
better
do.
branders. The Republicans are better branders than the Democrats.
And somebody once, I was like, drop names here. I once had a conversation with Bill Clinton in which he said that a certain Democratic senator and he were bemoaning the press, and the Republican senator, and the Republican senator said to him, the journalists, the press, they vote like you guys, but they think like us being Republicans. He said, you Democrats come here to use the government to do things. We don't think the government should do things, so we come for the power.
Interesting. Thank you very much.
So
Yeah, that's,
I don't know. That's not much of an answer about language.
No,
But yes, language matters. And if you can label people in a certain way, the label takes over and people aren't looking underneath to see what it means.
Somebody once suggested that instead of the death tax, reforming estate taxes should have been called the Paris Hilton Tax Fairness Act of 2020. There was a couple of actually Yale academics who suggested that. Just a couple of quick things. We think Democrats are really bad at branding. New Deal wasn't bad. Fair Deal wasn't bad. Great Society wasn't bad. New Frontier wasn't bad. This doesn't have to be. I Have a Dream wasn't bad. There were.
A more current one?
What?
Any more current one you can
Yeah,
think
no.
of?
No, I guess that maybe that's the problem.
Yeah.
But but there's nothing genetic or inherently ideological here. No, in fact, sometimes you look at Democratic speeches and it looks like they put the synonym finder on deal. The new and then synonym finder.
Fair deal. Someone just came up with fair deal.
Well, that was Harry Truman, I think. Help me. Socialism is complicated because every Democrat since Al Smith, at least as far as I could tell, I write about this in the book. It was funny, Al Smith accused Roosevelt of being a socialist, but Herbert Hoover had accused Al Smith of being a socialist in the 1928 campaign. So the word socialist, Ronald Reagan's great speech that came to national attention for Barry Goldwater in 1964, quoted Norman Thomas saying that Goldwater's defeat would stop the advance of socialism, and Ronald Reagan said, I think that's exactly what it will do. So that socialism has been used as an epithet, and it hasn't always worked. Now, the difference is that right now you have a very conscious and proud group of Democratic Socialists in the Democratic Party who are willing to embrace the name. What's fascinating about socialism as it polls is it's much more popular among young people than it is among older people. I think for older people, it has more of a resonance with Soviet communism, and there's been polling on this. For younger people, it has a real resonance with Denmark, Finland, Sweden, and Norway. Who the heck is afraid of Denmark, Finland, Sweden, and Norway? And I think part of the answer back is, and there was a Danish socialist did this great video, so you don't like it that it's free to go to college, so you don't like it that you don't have to worry about your health care. I think some of the fight will be on the substance. If you ask me, if I were a pure political consultant, I'd say, it's probably not the best word to use because you still got all these old folks who link it with Soviet communism, which really was a bad thing. But I think it can be fought successfully. I call myself a social democrat, which is a more complicated word, but they don't seem to attack that one as much. But that's another story. Thank you, sir.
Maybe we can try to be fast with
Yeah,
this, because there's a huge line.
Wow, yeah, this is see, who says people aren't engaged in politics? Could we do this? Could we collect like 2 or 3 at a time, and we can try to keep track, and then I can evade the really tough one? Go ahead.
Yeah,
Maybe 3 in a row.
it's great to be here with you. I also was an Abigail Spanberger volunteer canvassing, but there were 5,000 of us. She had more than 5,000 volunteers out there canvassing door to door in one congressional district, and she only won by 1.5%. That was the margin of victory, very close. So sometimes we get the sense, wow, 2018 is major. Yes, major, but not that can't be fragile is my point. And I'm a little worried about.
Well, you had to flip an awful lot of voters to get to that margin.
'Cause
it was an amazing shift.
It was, because 22% Republican the prior time. So, it was a dramatic shift. But I wanted to make a point a little about the Iowa thing, because, of course, none of us liked what happened there, right? None of us did. But on the other hand, that was a locally driven thing with people making decisions locally. And I really got a little PO'd with Joe Scarborough of knocking them. They're these local people. They're not they're not professional politicians, professional crafts. It comes to the point of this 2020 election. What do you see as the quality of the people that are helping advise these candidates in terms of really smart people who understand all the complexities that you have already shared, in your book and stuff, but who are able to essentially give the guidance that these candidates need to deal with a very smart, not very moral at all, but a very smart opponent. So that's my question.
Thank you. Can you hang on to that? Well, don't let me evade that. Please.
Hi. I appreciate you talking about faith in politics. I'm a pastor. And
bless you. Can you give us all a blessing? We need
bless
it.
You all. and I pastor a purple congregation, so people who would identify with conservatives and liberals.
May I ask what denomination?
Presbyterian Church USA.
Uh-huh.
And so I know it's going to come up. I've never been partisan. I don't want to put too much of a thumb on the scale. But how do I talk to my congregation about politics this season? What would your advice be?
You know, my short answer is play Mitt Romney's speech over and over and over again. If I could just say one word about that, I think the power of that speech is that he really, without doing it directly, took to task a form of right-wing Christianity that has capitulated entirely to Donald Trump. And
I can relate to that because I call myself a recovering evangelical. So,
thank God there are about 25% of evangelicals who are not in that category. We forget about them. But I think it's very important to reclaim the idea that religion is not somehow automatically a right-wing force. And I argue sometimes with my more conservative religious friends, have you looked at the polling on young people lately, where 40% of people under 40 are religiously disengaged? Don't you think some of that might come from the fact that religion is associated with being anti-LGBTQ or a Christian nationalist or connected to racism in some cases? I don't want to paint with a broad brush on racism, but there are some problems there too. But especially just take LGBTQ, that alone has shoved away a lot of young people. And identifying Christianity with a right-wing political regime, well, let's put it this way, it didn't really go well under Louis the 14th, you know. So anyway, but thank you. I don't want to compare Trump to... historical metaphors are dangerous, so I'm not making that direct comparison. But anyway, go ahead.
Do you want to take one more?
Yeah, I'll take one more, and then I'll go back to the first one, which you will refresh me on.
Maybe.
Very quickly, I'm most interested in your concept of progressive gradualism. I suspect a lot of us in the room of a certain age and level of experience find that appealing. I'd like to know how to advocate that kind of viewpoint for a younger generation where an issue like climate change is of incredible importance and an issue where time is of the essence.
So let me answer that and go back to the first one. I'll try to be real quick. That is a great question because, visionary gradualism does kind of sound a little middle-aged, doesn't it? Or maybe even older than middle-aged. And there are certain issues, in the book I sort of take a look at Martin Luther King's phrase, the fierce urgency of now, and try to see where that stands on this. And I also look at Martin Luther King's other great phrase, which is the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. And one of the reasons I want to qualify gradualism with a visionary word is that King was right, that at times gradualism is just a way to slow things down so much that nothing ever happens. And so I think it's important for somebody who does believe in step-by-step change to say this isn't about that. This is about doing today what can be done today so we can do what needs to be done tomorrow and the day after. On climate, there are also moments when there is that fierce urgency of now. And I argue that points in both directions. On the one hand, it means, yes, we cannot just sit around while the planet burns. And that we have less time than we would have had if we had started acting 10 or 20 years ago. But the other side of the fierce urgency of now is that if we spend all our time fighting for the perfect solution, we will never get started on the first step solution. And that there are probably a lot of people in this room who've worked on Capitol Hill. I cannot think of a piece of legislation, even stuff I really liked, that was ever perfect. I can't think about a piece of legislation that didn't pass with some kind of compromise and give back that had to be fought for down the road. And I think that the civil rights era was exciting. The rise of the environmental movement was exciting. The rise of the feminist movement was exciting. But the way change was made by those movements was a powerful change in people's consciousness about what needed to be done, and then steady work to get it done. Irving Howe, another great socialist, actually wrote a book called Steady Work. And I've always thought that's a great concept to bring to politics, because in politics there are no final victories, and it does take steady work over a period of time. But thank you for the question. I'm not sure my own kids would be persuaded by my answer. I'm going to try it on them. What the first
The
question?
first one was about recalling how many thousands of door-to-door volunteers there were for Abigail Spenberger. And I think and yet the win was so narrow. The importance of that kind of organizing, and I think the question was, how can we be certain that whoever the candidate is has
the kind of advice
the
they
kind
have.
of advice that would,
Yeah,
provide that kind of organization?
I mean, my impression is there are some really smart people around all of these potential candidates. I think all of them actually have. I have talked to people. You live in Washington. You talk to a lot of these kinds of people. There are an awful lot of people on lists who don't necessarily get called very often, and I wonder why they're on the list. But they're there, and I think that there have been sort of some clever strategic moves in these various campaigns. Probably partly because he came from nowhere. Mayor Pete's has certainly been pretty clever and strategic. So I'm less worried about these campaigns finding smart people than I am about the first half of his question, which is, Hillary Clinton's old line was, "It takes a village." It really took a metropolis to create that victory. It took several metropolises. And I think that level of mobilization needs to be rekindled and maintained. I think it can be. I think the energy is out there. But I agree with the first part, that without all those folks, that wouldn't have happened. And a lot of those districts were, in fact, quite close because they had been Republican districts. Sir, hello again. It's
Hi.
great to see you.
Great to see you always. Why didn't Joe Biden try to interfere in the impeachment process? Trump feared him as the front runner, and he would have had a good opportunity to defend he and his son.
Thank you. Good question. Let me hold that. And that's an excellent question. Sir, it's great to see you again. It's
Hello.
wonderful.
I stand here with the urgency of now. And you've mentioned Dr. King. Let me mention Frederick Douglass. He said, "Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are people who want crops without plowing the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the roar of its many waters." The last time we met in person was in Santiago, Chile, and outside of our hotel was a demonstration with graffiti over every single building. Will we need to go to the streets to make the change that needs to happen if we believe in freedom?
Ooh, wow. Give the man a round of applause. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Oh, you were the last questioner, so why don't I take your question and then...
Okay.
Thank you for that. I will answer it. I'll try with less eloquence. Go ahead. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, Hoya Saxa, as a Georgetown student.
What year are you in?
I'm a sophomore.
Oh, great. Thank you for coming.
Had to hit the shameless plug. But my question is, how do we basically depoliticize issues that a lot of conservatives might kind of try to make political, such as climate change? I know a lot of people have mentioned women's rights, issues that in many progressives' opinion shouldn't exactly be a political issue. But how do we kind of fight that urgency to politicize a lot of issues like that?
Thank you so much. So the Frederick Douglass agitation question, this question, what question did I miss? And then we're gonna stop. Correct?
Yeah, we're gonna stop in 5 minutes.
Oh yeah. What was the first question? Oh, Joe Biden. Just Biden. I think they made a calculation which may have been wrong, but it was reasonable, which is if you did go to answer, if Biden went to answer, he'd legitimize the story. It would sort of get worse rather than better, and they wanted to keep the focus on Trump. I'm also not sure what the Democrats, I don't think the Democrats in Congress wanted to take that path. In retrospect, If you look at the results in Iowa, maybe he will wish he had come and confronted it in that way. But I think they made a not unreasonable calculation. It wasn't worth taking their bait and making that fight. I guess I'll close with Frederick Douglass. Let me just answer your question. The word politicized that you used is interesting because I am sort of pro-politics, not anti-politics. I don't think politics is a dirty word. And so, in a sense, these issues do have to be politicized in the sense you have to create a majority for action, and that's politics. However, I think, if I may, take your question as saying something slightly different, which is to distort these issues into things that they are not, and doing that for political purposes. That is where I think there is a fight to be made. It's really troubling that 10 years ago, there were a number of Republicans who were perfectly prepared to say, yes, human action is causing climate change and we need to do something about it. Joe Lieberman and John McCain had a pretty good bill. Again, it probably didn't go as far as some people wanted, but it was a pretty aggressive bill. Senator Corker was talking about a carbon tax back then. And then suddenly, the whole party shifted toward kind of apologetics for the extraction industries, for oil and coal and gas, oil and coal in particular, and then the issue has become what it is now. Now, I agree it's got to be discussed as a matter of common good, a good Georgetown word, and national interest. And I think we have to remind people that the roots of the word conservation are the same as the roots of the word conservative. And trying to conserve our planet is a pretty conservative thing because our planet burning up is a pretty, revolutionary thing that I don't think any of us want to see. And now on agitation. I am first of all, I'm very sympathetic to agitation. I write a lot in the book about how historically the left and activism on the left has interacted with more moderate progressive government. One of the models for me is the relationship between Franklin Roosevelt and Sidney Hillman of the CIO, where the CIO organized the country. Heck, they had sit-down strikes. They were very militant. And they pressured Roosevelt in more progressive directions. And Roosevelt welcomed that because it gave him more room, but at critical moments they supported Roosevelt. It's said, although I could not, historians have never been able to pin it down, but A. Philip Randolph, when he was organizing for an Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, visited Roosevelt, and Roosevelt said, "I'm for it, now make me do it." And of course, Martin Luther King brought extraordinary pressure on John F. Kennedy and then Lyndon Johnson to pass the Civil Rights Bill. What we need is a successful, pragmatic interaction where the people who have vision and who are pushing for justice push hard, take to the streets if necessary, but to interact with more moderate progressives in power, not as enemies, but as people who know they need a fire lit underneath them. The last thing, do you have 2 words? Because we got to shut down.
So quick. The horse race. Could Buttigieg or Bloomberg beat Trump?
I am of the view right now, I don't want to do much horse race because I am totally confused about the horse race. I'll just be totally candid about that. In principle, I think anybody can beat Trump if they run the right campaign. I think that they have to run campaigns that make it easier rather than harder for people to beat Trump. But we can talk after, or maybe during the debate if you're going to stay. But I believe they can. Can I just close because we're supposed to put on the
2 minutes
debate
to close,
for
yeah.
those, but we can talk after if you'd like. I just want to close with the following, and this goes also to your question. My friend, and maybe a friend of some of the people in this room, Mark Shields, likes to say that in both politics and in both religion and politics, you can either spend your time hunting heretics or seeking converts. I think that this moment is a moment when we must all become convert seekers. If there was ever a time when our emphasis should be not on hunting heretics, not on emphasizing small differences we have with potential allies, but the large amount in common we have with people who want to move in the same direction, not to chastise people because their nav system gives a little bit of a different answer than our nav system, or their speed limit is just a little bit slower than our speed limit. We all want to restore progress to our country, and we will only do that if we work together. And so I want ask all of you to do tonight, I'd love you to buy the book, but what I really want you all to do is please become convert seekers. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you both so much.